Thank you. Alrighty, we thank Alice for volunteering to. Okay. Alrighty. So the cardiovascular system. What does the cardiovascular system mean? Cardio means the heart. Cardio means the heart. Vascular means the blood vessels or the conduits through which the blood flows. So what is the heart? The heart is a pump. It's a pump that generates a gradient for us. And this idea of a gradient is not alien to us. Remember in the past when we talked about if you have two slabs A and B and you put in 700 millivolt and 100 millivolt on slab B, 700 millivolt on slab A, you connect them together, they're gonna even out at how much?
At 800.
At 400. 700 plus 100, that's 800. And the flow of electricity is going to flow from 700 into 100 until we equilibrate. So there's a gradient. That's an electrical gradient. And we also can replace the 700 millivolt with degrees Celsius. 100 degrees Celsius. You attach them together, the temperature is going to flow from the 700, an area of a high thermal concentration, to an area of a low thermal concentration, and they both are going to even out at 400 degrees Celsius. 400 degrees Celsius. That's an example. That is no longer electrical gradient. That is thermal gradient. That is thermal gradient. Thermal gradient. Then we can have 700 millimoles of glucose and 100 millimoles of glucose, and the glucose is going to diffuse through a semi-permeable membrane, and they both are going to even out at 400 degrees Celsius, and that is known as concentration gradient. So what does the heart do? The heart pumps blood so hardly that it moves and circulates from where the heart is through the blood vessels and moves from your heart to the tissue. And that is pressure gradient. Pressure gradient. That's why they say blood pressure. Pressure gradient. So the blood flows through a pressure gradient from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. When you squeeze that toothpaste and all the toothpaste came out, why did the toothpaste come out the other way from where you're squeezing? Because that's high pressure. It goes from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. When you open the faucet, the water comes out from where the pump is into the outside. The tissue receives blood. The blood doesn't go to your heart, it returns to your heart, but it goes from your heart. The heart pumps, that's the pump, and it sends generating the pressure that mediates the passage, facilitates the passage of the fluid from the heart pump into the tissue. Okay, so this is the cardiovascular system, and the cardiovascular system is reliant on a pressure gradient. And the pressure gradient is important for all fluids. And the law says that fluids will never move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. Except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. Except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. So, what are the two types of fluids? Number one is the liquid. Water is a fluid. Water is a liquid. Water is a liquid. So, fluids can either be liquids, or what else can the fluids be? Fluid is a solid. So this is a fluid. This is a fluid. Solution is a liquid. Fluids are either solution. Fluids are either, now you're confusing me. Fluids are either liquid or gas. Gas. So that's why your respiratory system is also dependent on pressure changes. So when your lungs expand and you take a deep breath and all the diaphragm moves down, it expands your thoracic cave. And when it expands the thoracic cave, your lungs are going to stretch and the air is going to flow from high pressure atmosphere into your lungs. But when you exhale, all the air comes out, you squeeze the lungs like toothpaste. So there's high pressure on the lung and air is going to come out. So whether you're fluid, liquid like in your cardiovascular system, or if you are a gas fluid like in your respiratory system, you will not move except from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. That's why hemoglobin picks up oxygen where there's a lot of partial pressure for oxygen in the lung. When you take a deep breath, your lung got a lot of oxygen. So when the hemoglobin gets to the lung, it'll fill up with so much oxygen. But when it goes to the tissue has just a little bit of oxygen. So it will give it oxygen, and the tissue has a lot of metabolic waste. And among that metabolic waste is your carbon dioxide. Then it will take carbon dioxide from where there's a lot of it. So from an area of a high pressure to a low pressure area. So in the lung, high pressure for oxygen. In the tissue, high pressure for carbon dioxide. So hemoglobin will take oxygen from the lung, high pressure, and give it to the tissue where there's low pressure of oxygen. And take carbon dioxide from the tissue, because the carbon dioxide is giving out as a metabolic waste in the tissue. The tissue is breaking down sugar. The tissue is breaking down lipids. Tissue is breaking down for catabolism proteins. And it's generating so much metabolic waste like carbon dioxide. And among that carbon dioxide, that is going to be high area of partial. That's why the restaurant got a lot of garbage, because it's making a lot of food and it has a lot of garbage. So the tissue has a lot of garbage. This is among it is the carbon dioxide. So it's going to have a lot of pressure for carbon dioxide in the tissue, not the lung. But the lung has got a lot of oxygen because you take a deep breath, fill it up with oxygen. Okay, so the blood. So now that's the cardiovascular system. It is just the heart and the blood vessel. Then what is the circulatory system? What is the circulatory system? So heart plus blood vessels, that is your cardiovascular system, CVS. What is the circulatory system? The circulatory system is, don't worry about it. When it dies, that's all you guys getting. He's gonna fall. Okay, it's fine. Okay, the cardiovascular system plus what will give you the circulatory system? I disappeared. The circulatory system. Blood. What are we pumping? We're pumping blood. So the cardiovascular system is like a cadaver, just a heart and blood vessels, nothing in them. Maybe formalin to keep it from putrefying and smelling and decomposing. But the circulatory system is when you have your pump, Your blood vessel, imagine you have a subway and a subway station and nobody inside the subway. That's just the cardiovascular system, just the heart and the blood vessels. But when you add the blood inside it, that's gonna be your circulatory system. Now, we gotta talk about this blood. This blood, we are responsible of talking about this blood. We are responsible of knowing what this blood that we are pumping. So if you take a test tube in the laboratory, okay, so if you look in a laboratory test tube, okay, and you take a sample of blood, red blood, that's a sample of blood, all red. They used to think that this blood is all red because red blood cells. When you take it and put this blood in a centrifuge, this centrifuge is going to give us, what is a centrifuge? The centrifuge is going to spin. We're going to put the test tube in one of these circles and in one of these holes, and it's going to spin for us at very, very high speed. It's going to spin for us this blood that we put in our test tube at very high speeds, and then we're gonna have the following. We're going to have red blood cells only, nothing but red blood cells, nothing but red blood cells, just red blood cells, and this is known as the hematocrit, just pure red blood cells, hematocrit, hematocrit. And this hematocrit is actually red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes. Erythrocytes. Hematocrit is erythrocytes. And that is a portion of our blood that is the heaviest, because on the bottom, you're the heaviest on the bottom. You're the heaviest on the bottom. You're the heaviest on the bottom. And that's the hematocrit. Then they found, and this is about 45%. This is about 45% of your blood is going to be the hematocrit. 45% of your blood is going to be the hematocrit. Then the layer above it is this yellowish creamy coat known as the buffy coat. This is the buffy coat, or the yellow creamy coat. The yellow creamy coat. And at the top, you will have, and this yellow creamy coat is about 1% or less than 1%. And this buffy coat, yellow creamy coat, is actually made up of white blood cells, known as WBCs. They're also known as leukocytes, and it has platelets, known as thrombocytes. And on the top layer, you will have the remaining 55%. 55%. That is known as the plasma. That is known as the blood plasma. And this blood plasma has a lot of water, solutes, electrolytes, water, solutes, electrolytes, proteins, hormones, metabolic waste, pretty much everything that is not the other two. If you are red blood cell, if you devoid red blood cells, you have red packed red blood cell, no white blood cells. What is that? That's the hematocrit. So that shows you how much of our blood is 45%. That's the hematocrit. How much of our blood is your buffy coat, the yellow creamy coat, the leukocytes? These are less than 1%. These are less than 1%. These are less than 1%. And the plasma is everything else, about 55%. And it's clear colored. So all these questions are fair game for the exam. Okay? What percentage is plasma? What percentage is the buffy coat? What is the percentage of your hematocrit? What is hematocrit? What is hematocrit? What is the percentage of the hematocrit? 45%. What is it? Just red blood cells. What are the red blood cells known as? Erythrocytes. What about the buffy coat? Why is the buffy coat only 1%? Because the white blood cells, we only need them in infection. So in this community right now, the school community, do you have a lot of cops? No. 90%, that's the student are 90%, professors are 5%, administrators are 1%, public safety are like 3%, and maybe like the cops are just a little bit. So that's why in your body, the white blood cells, they are there for immune defense. When there's an infectious microbe invading your body, they are there to defend your body. So if there is no infection, why should there be a lot of white blood cells? That's why they're always a little bit. They only increase when they are needed. Do you see a lot of cops here, a lot of army here if there's like crime? But usually there isn't. Same thing with a healthy person, does not have a lot of crime, a lot of disease, infection, so they have low white blood cells. What about the platelets? Platelets are known as thrombocytes, as I mentioned. These thrombocytes only increase in number when you're bleeding, when you're leaking blood. They're like Band-Aids. They close your red blood cell, they close your blood vessels and prevent blood leakage. Okay? They preserve blood volume. So only when you're bleeding they increase. That's why they're always less than 1%. It is the plasma who is the water, everything else, water, hormones, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, electrolytes, the potassium, the calcium, everything you name it, you will see that it is in the plasma. So the fractions are 1% or less, the middle creamy layer, buffy coat. 35%, that's your hematocrit. 55%, that is your plasma. So this is the blood. Now let's look at what happens to the blood inside our heart. So inside our heart, before we look inside the model, we have to have a conceptual diagram. We're supposed to have a conceptual diagram reflecting the concept. And the concept is that The concept is that you have your lungs up here. These are your lungs. These are your lungs. And this is, let's say this is your atria. And I said that's wrong to say atria. We got to say left atria. So your lung will send us good blood. That's step number one. Step number one is when the lung send good blood. That's step number one. Good blood is rich in oxygen, rich in nutrients for metabolism, rich in nutrients. Is going to go into the right atria. I'm starting the left atria. Between the left atria and the left ventricle is a valve that has two cusps. And the valve between the atria and the ventricle, that's your ventricle, your left ventricle. The valve between the atria and the ventricle are known as your atrioventricular valve. Okay, so the first step, blood is taken from the lungs to the left atria through if you're going to the heart, if you're going towards the heart, that makes you a vein, no matter what kind of blood you're taking, oxygenated or deoxygenated. So this is oxygen-rich blood going to the heart from the lung. If you have anything to do with the lung, if one of your ends, either the end going to the lung or away from the lung, that makes you pulmonary immediately. So this is a pulmonary vein coming from the lung to the left atria. That's step number one. Step number two, the blood will enter the left atria. That's step number two. Step number three, blood will flow from the left atria to the left ventricle through the atrioventricular valve on the left side, and it has only two cusps. They used to call it the mitral valve because the mitral bishops of the church have a hat that has two cusps, known as the mitral valve and the bicuspid valve, because it has two cusps, bicuspid valve. So the blood will now flow through the atrioventricular valve, and that's step number three. Then step number four is when the blood enters the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is going to eject and pump the blood away from the heart. If your direction is away from the heart, that makes you away a artery. And the biggest artery that takes fresh oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle, that is your aorta. Your aorta. You see, your aorta is taking good blood from the left ventricle into your tissue. You see, that's your tissue. That's your tissue. It has so many cells. Your tissue 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 has so many cells. And these cells will receive the oxygen-rich blood, O2, oxygen-rich blood, nutrient-rich blood, okay? And it will take all the oxygen, will perform aerobic respiration, and oxidative phosphorylation. Then, you know, when you order a lot of boxes of pizza and Papa John's, then you gotta have to, you take them as good, but you're gonna throw them out as garbage. So now that was number one. Step number one. That's step number two. Step number three. Okay, you can zoom, you can pause it later on when I send it to you, and just go and take your time, your pace. Okay? So that's three, going through the atrioventricular valve. Then that is the left ventricle. The left ventricle will squeeze to send out to the aorta. This is step number four, blood in the ventricle. Step number five, blood is going to the tissue. The tissue would use it then will send out nasty blood. And we said when you are now going towards the heart, so now we're returning to the heart. So that makes you a vein. If you return to the heart, that makes you a vein. So now they would return back to the heart. And after they return to the heart, they return to the, what do they return to? The right ventricle. They return to the right ventricle. And the right ventricle has another valve that is between the right ventricle and the right atria. Between the right atria, the bad blood goes back to the right atria, then will go through the tricuspid valve. This valve does not have two cusps, it has three cusps, known as the tricuspid valve. So bad blood will enter the right atria. So that's step number 6. Bad blood will enter the right atria, step number 7. Then bad blood will go through your tricuspid valve between the right atria and the right ventricle. That is step number 7. Step number 8, the right ventricle will fill. Step number 8.
You did 7 twice, Professor. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So that's step number 8. And that's step number 9. And then the right ventricle is gonna pump the bad blood back to the lungs. And if it's going to the lung, that makes it pulmonary. Going away from the heart, that's pulmonary artery. So this is a conceptual understanding. You also have to remember, these here between the atria and the ventricle are known as atrioventricular valve. But there's another set of valves between the ventricle and these great vessels. So there is a valve here between all of them are tricuspid. The only one who was bicuspid is your mitral valve between the left atria and the right, between the left atria and the left ventricle. So this is known as the semilunar valve. Semilunar valves. Semilunar valves are tricuspid, and the first semilunar valve is on the left side of your heart between the left ventricle and go into the aorta, and the aorta will take the blood back into the system. And then from the tissue, the blood would return to the atria, and the atria would squeeze to reflux the blood into your right ventricle. Then from your right ventricle, we send blood out through the pulmonary arteries, and there's another set of valves here, and these are also known as semilunar. This one is semilunar valve. This one is a semilunar valve. This is the aortic valve, and that is the pulmonary valve, returning the blood back. So this is the sequence. So let's go over it again. Good blood sent from the lung into the left atria. From the lung into the atria, red blood, good blood, going from the lung to the left atria. The next step, left atria would squeeze to send blood into the atrioventricular valves, especially this one with two bicuspid valve. Number 4, blood will enter through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Left ventricle would squeeze and send blood away from the heart. So that if you're going away, that's an artery. And this artery is known as the aorta. And the valve between the ventricle and the aorta is known, the two sets are known as semilunar valves, but this specific one is known as your aortic valve. Aortic valve. And then we go to the tissue. The tissue receives oxygen for aerobic respiration and oxidative phosphorylation. They will send out the garbage, the bad blood from the tissue to the heart. So if you're going to the heart, that's a vein, and you're going from the system, so that makes it systemic vein. and the artery is going to the aorta is going to the tissue, so that makes it systemic artery. The aorta is a systemic artery, and these guys are returning from the tissue system known as systemic veins. They return to the right atria, and the right atria would contract to reflux the bad blue blood through your atrioventricular tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle would squeeze, and all the blood will exit through the semilunar valve and then would return back into the lungs. So you have to watch this a lot and repeat this a lot, and then when we look at the models, things are gonna start to make sense. Okay, you had your hand up. You see? Yeah. So you just go. You need to spend a lot of time to know this circle. You gotta know this circle, how it happens. So you can repeat the video again and again and read the book and watch videos. So this is not something where one contact with me and you just got it. You don't have to worry. It's like that story where the three little animals, one built his house from grass, and then one built his house from sticks, and then one from stone, and then he went oof like that to the stone, they flew away, and the bricks didn't, and then you got it. You don't need to study it again. You just you need to go repeat this over and over again until you get it. Okay? So that's the concept. In your body, it doesn't look like that. Let's look at how it looks like in the body. So let's now connect how this happens in your body. So step number 1, good blood coming from the lung to the left atria. So we said anatomical position. Assemble it with my body. That's anatomical position. So where is my step number 1? Blood coming from the lung into the atria, right here, up here. So now the blood entered right here. That's the left atria. Where is my bicuspid valve? That's my bicuspid valve, is the one in the middle. You see it? The one in the middle between the left atria and the right atria. That's the one in the middle. Then you have left ventricle. This is that's the left side, right? So in the left side, you gotta find the left side. You gotta assemble it with your body. Your left is the heart left. Yeah. So this one here, that's your left atria. The blood just came in here. It went through this valve right here, this hole. You see this plastic hole? If it's not there, then look at another model. But you see it in my model, right? You see it here. You see it in my model. You see it? Yeah, if you don't have it there, then you just have it with me. You have it, fine. So you go through that bicuspid valve, has 2 cusps. Then we enter into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is gonna squeeze the blood out through this big red right here. Blood is coming out here from the ventricle through this red. And do you see here inside? You see this deep tricuspid semilunar valve? Do you see it right here?
Where?
Going this one. You see this yellow one?
Yeah.
No, here, please. This yellow one right here. That's going from the left ventricle to the tissue is right here inside. Deep is number 45. If you look deeper inside, that's your number 45. That's your semilunar. That's your semilunar valve, or the aortic valve. That's the aortic valve, which is a semilunar valve. The same way the bicuspid valve is an atrioventricular valve, and the tricuspid valve is an atrioventricular valve because it's between the atria and the ventricle. Both are semilunar, but this one is an aortic semilunar, and the other one is going to be a pulmonary semilunar valve. Then that is my aorta. You see my big red aorta? And blood is now went to the tissue. Blood is now perfusing the tissue. Now blue blood is returning back to the right atria. You see the right atria? That's my right atria. That's my right atria. That's my right atria. And then through it, you see this valve, tricuspid valve. That is your atrioventricular valve, tricuspid valve. Then it goes down to the right ventricle. Then it will contract and the blood will flow out through this pulmonary this pulmonary trunk, and you see that there is a semilunar valve between the ventricle and the pulmonary artery, and then blood returns back to the lung. So now take time, examine this model deeply. Examine the model deeply, please, and try to assemble what we have on the board with the model. Yes, you had a question? Okay. All right. Okay, guys. Here's the